Rachel Torres had never thought of her quiet suburban street as a place where anything dramatic could happen. For more than 20 years, she had lived in the same modest but well-kept single-story house, a brick-front property with a deep driveway leading to a detached garage at the back. The driveway had always been more than just a strip of concrete for her. It was the place where she parked her dependable silver pickup truck, the same vehicle she used not only for her own errands but also for the small side business she had taken up after her husband passed away, delivering furniture, gardening supplies, and other large items for people in the neighborhood. The truck was an essential part of her independence, a symbol that she could still take care of herself and run her own life without leaning on anyone. Rachel knew her neighbors in the way people do in areas where residents stay for decades. Polite waves, the occasional brief chat about the weather, or trash pickup schedules, but never anything personal. She liked it that way. Her evenings were quiet. She would sit on her porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the cicadas and the faint hum of the distant highway. She didn't meddle in anyone else's business, and she expected the same courtesy in return. The driveway was especially important to her because she had no desire to park her truck on the street. In her view, street parking was a magnet for careless drivers, and she had seen enough side mirrors knocked off over the years to reinforce that belief. Besides, the driveway offered a straight walk to her kitchen door, making unloading groceries or work supplies far easier. On the night that would change her perception of her neighborhood, she followed the same routine she always did. She pulled into the driveway just after 8, returning from a day that had taken her across 3 towns to deliver a set of antique chairs. She left the truck backed in, as she preferred, so she could pull out quickly in the morning without reversing blindly into the street. The air was warm and carried the smell of fresh-cut grass. She had mowed her lawn that afternoon and was still a little proud of how even the lines looked. Rachel glanced up and down the street before locking her truck. A few porch lights glowed faintly, but otherwise the block seemed to be winding down into its usual calm. She took a long shower, made herself a simple dinner, and settled into her recliner to watch the late-night news. There was nothing to suggest that anything unusual was brewing. No odd noises outside, no strange cars passing by more often than usual. By the time she went to bed just after midnight, her mind was on tomorrow's schedule, which included an early trip to the supply warehouse. She drifted off to sleep under the soft hum of the ceiling fan, secure in the thought that the next day would unfold like any other. In her years living there, the worst she had dealt with was a stray cat digging in her flower bed or a package delivered to the wrong house. She had no enemies, no disputes, no reason to imagine that anyone would target her. But as the night deepened, while she lay unaware, something deliberate and destructive was being set in motion just a few feet from where she slept. By dawn, the ordinary life she had so carefully maintained would feel like it had been invaded, and the strip of concrete she had driven across thousands of times would no longer be a simple part of her home. It would become the scene of a baffling and infuriating act that would pull her into a situation she never asked for and never expected to face. Rachel woke earlier than usual the next morning, stirred from sleep by an odd, acrid smell that didn't belong in the cool, clean air she was used to at sunrise. At first, she thought it might be from a neighbor's overworked lawnmower or someone burning trash far away. But when she stepped into her kitchen and looked out the window above the sink, her stomach sank. Something was wrong. The driveway, the familiar strip of pale, weathered concrete, was no longer visible. Instead, it was a dull, wet, gray expanse. The surface rippled and uneven in places, and in the middle of it, her pickup truck sat sunken in, the wheels buried up to the rims in a thick layer of fresh cement. She blinked, half expecting her mind to be playing tricks, but the scene held. It was unmistakable. Someone had poured an enormous amount of cement across her entire driveway during the night, effectively trapping her vehicle in place. For a long, stunned moment, she stood there gripping the edge of the sink, her mind trying to make sense of the sheer absurdity of it. The air outside still carried the chemical tang of curing concrete, and even from inside she could see faint heat waves rising from the surface in the early sun. The cement hadn't been there long. It was still soft enough to glisten, though already hardening in the warm morning air. Rachel's first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake, that perhaps a contractor had arrived at the wrong address. But as her eyes swept over the scene, she noticed something else. A laminated card propped against her front door, fluttering slightly in the breeze. She stepped outside, careful to keep to the grass to avoid stepping on the wet cement, and picked it up. The card was printed in bold black letters. Vehicle exceeded permissible stationary time. Remedial action completed at owner's expense. Below that, in smaller type, was a vague reference to a property maintenance committee and a stylized logo she had never seen before. There was no phone number, no address, nothing that offered a clear way to contact whoever had left it. Her first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by a rush of anger that left her hands trembling. She turned the card over, hoping for more information, but the back was blank except for a smudge of gray dust. Cement powder, she realized. The absurdity of the situation hit her again in waves. Her truck was immobilized in her own driveway, encased in a material designed to last decades. Whoever had done this hadn't just inconvenienced her. They had destroyed her property and made it impossible for her to go about her day, all under the guise of some self-appointed authority. Her instinct was to call the police immediately, but she hesitated for a few seconds, thinking about how she would even explain this. It sounded insane, like something out of a bad prank video, except the damage was very real. She forced herself to focus, pulling her phone from her pocket and dialing the non-emergency police line, explaining in as clear a voice as she could that someone had vandalized her driveway during the night and trapped her vehicle in wet cement. The dispatcher's tone shifted from skepticism to formality as she promised to send an officer. While she waited, Rachel walked slowly around the edge of the yard, taking in more details. The cement hadn't been poured haphazardly. It covered the driveway in an even sheet, extending slightly onto the public sidewalk. At the street end, she noticed faint tire marks in the dust, as if a heavy truck had backed in to deliver the load. There were no stray bags of mix or tools left behind, suggesting the job had been planned and cleaned up carefully. It wasn't the work of bored teenagers. This had taken coordination, money, and a deliberate intent to send a message. When the patrol car arrived, the officer, a tall, tired-looking man with a coffee cup in hand, listened to her account, jotted notes, and walked around the property snapping photos. His expression was difficult to read, but when she showed him the laminated card, he frowned and asked if she recognized the name or the logo. She told him she didn't, and he studied it a moment before slipping it into an evidence bag. He explained that he would file it as a case of property damage and vandalism, but cautioned that without clear footage or witnesses, finding the person responsible could be difficult. Rachel bristled at the implication that this might simply go unsolved, but she kept her tone calm, asking him to make sure she received a copy of the report for her insurance claim. The officer agreed, took down her contact information, and left, leaving her standing in the yard, staring at her truck as if it had been fossilized in place. Her mind churned with questions. Who would go to such lengths? Why her? There had been no warnings, no knocks on the door, no neighborly request to move her vehicle. Even if someone believed she had parked too long, the idea of pouring cement as a solution was absurd, vindictive, and far beyond anything she could have imagined. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was not a random act. The precision, the neatness of the work, and the odd, official-sounding language on the card all pointed to something planned, something calculated, and whoever had done it was confident enough to leave a cryptic calling card behind. Standing there in the rising heat, Rachel realized that the driveway she had driven over thousands of times without thought had suddenly become a trap, a stage for a message she couldn't yet decipher, and that the quiet predictability of her street had been fractured in a way that wouldn't easily be put back together. Rachel spent the rest of that morning moving between the house and the front yard, unable to sit still. The police report was filed, but the officer's neutral tone and lack of urgency had left her unsettled. She kept replaying his words in her mind, how, without footage or witnesses, there might be nothing they could do. And the thought of whoever had done this walking away without consequence made her chest tighten with frustration. By mid-morning, the cement had hardened enough that there was no hope of freeing the truck without heavy machinery, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. Her work for the day was canceled, deliveries rescheduled, and she had to call the hardware store she'd promised to supply that afternoon and explain she wouldn't be able to make it. The manager's voice was polite but strained, and she knew she might have just lost a client. The financial implications added a sharp edge to her anger. She decided that if the police couldn't or wouldn't move quickly, she had to take parallel steps, not to replace their work but to make sure she had every possible record in case this turned into a drawn-out dispute. She started by calling her insurance company, spending nearly an hour on hold before being connected to an adjuster who asked her to email photos of the damage and a copy of the police report once she had it. The adjuster's calm professionalism steadied her a little, but when she explained that the cement covered the entire driveway and embedded her vehicle, there was a long pause before he told her they might have to involve a specialist to assess. Structural damage to the property. That phrase, structural damage, landed heavily in her mind because it meant this wasn't just about removing the cement. If the pour had been deep enough or improperly cured, it could cause cracks or drainage problems that would haunt her for years. As she spoke with the adjuster, she kept pacing the edge of the yard, her eyes drifting toward the street where faint tire impressions still marked where the delivery truck had been. She followed the lines with her gaze, noting they seemed to come from the west end of the street, where only a few houses stood before the road bent toward a small commercial strip. The thought of walking down there crossed her mind, but she dismissed it quickly. The last thing she needed was to be seen poking around and have someone claim she was harassing them. Instead, she decided to consult someone with the right expertise. Pulling out her phone, she called a local concrete contractor she had once hired for a patio job. The man, Gary, remembered her, and when she described what had happened, he whistled low into the phone and told her bluntly that whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. He explained how fast-setting mixes could be poured and leveled in under an hour if you had the right crew and tools, and how the precision of the pour suggested it wasn't just a random stunt. When she asked if he could come by to look, he agreed, but warned that removing the cement without damaging the driveway underneath would be difficult and expensive. The conversation left her both grateful for his insight and chilled by the confirmation that this had been deliberate, skilled work. By early afternoon, the heat was radiating off the cement in shimmering waves, and Rachel decided to walk to the corner store for a drink, needing a break from staring at the damage. On her way back, she noticed her neighbor across the street, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Parker, standing at her mailbox with an expression that seemed a little too curious. Rachel waved, but the woman only gave a brief nod before retreating inside. It wasn't unusual for Mrs. Parker to be reserved, but something about her quick withdrawal nagged at Rachel, as if the woman knew more than she was willing to say. When Gary arrived later, he spent nearly half an hour examining the driveway, tapping at the edges with a hammer and making notes. His verdict was worse than she'd feared. The cement was poured over a layer of mesh reinforcement, meaning it had been intended to last. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to immobilize the truck temporarily. They wanted to make removal as time-consuming and costly as possible. Rachel asked him how much it would cost to clear it, and when he gave her the figure, she felt her stomach drop. It was more than she earned in a month of steady work. She thanked him, promised to let him know once the insurance weighed in, and watched him drive away, leaving her with the oppressive silence of the afternoon. Just before sunset, as she was locking the side gate, she spotted something near the curb, a fragment of laminated plastic half buried in the grass. Picking it up, she realized it was identical in texture to the card left on her door, but this one was torn, with only a partial logo and a few printed words visible. It looked as though someone had dropped it in a hurry, and the tear suggested it might have been ripped from a larger sheet. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the strange mix of vindication and dread that came from finding even a small piece of evidence. It wasn't much, but it proved that the card on her door wasn't a one-off prop. There were more of them, possibly prepared in advance. That night, as she sat in her living room with the lights low, Rachel tried to think through her next moves logically. She would follow up with the police once the report was ready, press the insurance for a timeline, and ask Gary for a written statement about the intentional nature of the pour. But beyond the practical steps, she couldn't shake the deeper unease. This wasn't just vandalism. It felt like an assertion of control, a calculated intrusion into her life designed to unsettle her, and it was working. The quiet of her street no longer felt neutral. Every sound outside made her glance toward the window, and every passing car drew her eyes to the driveway where her truck sat. Entombed in gray stone, a mute testament to someone's determination to make her life harder. The next morning, Rachel forced herself to start the day methodically, resisting the temptation to stand by the window and glare at the driveway as she had done the day before. She knew that if she let her frustration dictate her actions, she would end up pacing in circles, so she focused instead on the sequence of steps she could take that might actually move things forward. The first call she made was to the police department's records office to check on the incident report. After being transferred twice and waiting on hold for 15 minutes, she finally spoke to a clerk who confirmed that the report was processed and could be picked up at the front desk. She thanked the clerk, grabbed her bag, and walked to the bus stop at the corner since her truck was still sealed in place. The bus ride downtown was slow and crowded, and the motion made her restless, but she tried to use the time to think about her next calls and appointments. When she arrived at the station, the receptionist handed her the report in a thin manila folder. She stepped aside to read it and was struck by how clinical it sounded. Suspected vandalism. Unknown perpetrator. Damage to private property. The language was correct but bloodless, reducing the hours of planning, the deliberate choice of materials, and the personal violation she felt into a few detached sentences. Still, it was a necessary piece of paper, and she folded it carefully into her bag. Her next stop was the city's public works office, housed in a building that always smelled faintly of dust and copier toner. She had decided to check whether any permits or requests had been filed recently that might relate to her property. After a short wait, a clerk in a pale blue shirt typed her address into the database and frowned. "There was a request filed about 3 weeks ago," he said slowly, turning the monitor slightly so she could see. On the screen was a scanned document titled Temporary Parking Restriction for Safety and Maintenance, signed not by any city official but by an individual she recognized immediately, Karen Miller, the neighbor who lived 2 houses down. Karen was a woman Rachel had spoken to only a handful of times, usually in brief and somewhat clipped exchanges about minor neighborhood matters. She remembered Karen as precise in her words and quick to mention how things should be done. The idea that she would file an official-looking request to restrict parking at Rachel's address was startling. The clerk explained that while such a document would normally require city approval to have any force, this one had been received, but never formally processed, meaning it held no legal authority. Yet here it was, in the system, with Rachel's address clearly typed in. She asked if she could get a copy, and the clerk obliged, printing it out and stamping it with the city seal to confirm it was an unprocessed submission. Rachel left the building with the paper in hand, her mind spinning with questions about how Karen had even known the correct office to send it to, and why she would do it at all. On the bus ride back, she remembered the fragment of laminated plastic she had found by the curb, and wondered if Karen had more of those cards in her possession. It would explain the uniformity of the card left on her door and the professional-looking logo. Still, she knew better than to march up to Karen's front step and demand answers. That kind of confrontation might feel satisfying in the moment but would accomplish nothing productive, and could easily be twisted against her. Instead, she called her insurance adjuster again and explained that she had obtained a potentially relevant document suggesting intent. The adjuster told her to scan and email it, promising it would be added to her claim file. The adjuster also suggested that if she suspected a specific person, she should share the name with the investigating officer, which made sense but also made her uneasy. Accusing someone without incontrovertible proof could backfire. When she got home, Rachel pulled her kitchen chair close to the dining table, spread out the police report, the unprocessed request, and the torn fragment of plastic. She studied them together, looking for any small detail that might have been overlooked. That was when she noticed something odd. On the printed request, in the box for contact phone number, Karen had entered a number that Rachel didn't recognize. She decided to call it from her landline, blocking her own caller ID. The phone rang twice before a man's voice answered brusquely, giving only a company name, something that sounded like Premier Site Solutions. Rachel thanked him quickly and hung up before he could ask who she was. A quick online search revealed that Premier Site Solutions was a small contracting company that specialized in rapid concrete pours for commercial and municipal clients. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. If Karen had this company's number on an unprocessed city form and her driveway had been poured over with industrial precision, then the gap between suspicion and proof was narrowing. She called the police station again, asked for the officer who had taken her initial report, and left a message stating she had new information and a potential lead on the company that might have done the work. She didn't expect a call back the same day, but 2 hours later the officer rang her doorbell. He listened carefully as she laid out what she had found, examining the printed request and jotting down the contractor's name. His expression didn't change much, but he told her this was substantially more useful than most tips they received in similar cases. He explained that while the presence of a contractor's name didn't prove anything by itself, it gave them a legitimate reason to reach out and request job logs and delivery records. Rachel felt a flicker of relief for the first time since this started, not because the case was anywhere near resolved, but because the pieces were beginning to align into something tangible. As evening fell, she stepped onto her porch and looked at the driveway, still a dull, immovable slab with her truck locked in place. The day had given her a clearer path forward. Formal records, a potential contractor, and a name already in the city's files, but it had also confirmed that this was not a random act. Someone had used the trappings of official procedure, however sloppily, to justify an act of destruction, and that someone lived close enough to watch it happen. The thought brought with it a sharper kind of unease, the kind that made her keep the porch light on long after the sun went down and double-check the lock on her front door before she finally let herself rest. 2 days later, Rachel's sense of cautious progress was disrupted in a way that made her realize just how far the situation could spiral if she wasn't careful. The police had not yet given her any update on the contractor lead, but she woke that morning to the sound of a vehicle idling outside her house. When she stepped onto her porch, she saw a flatbed truck parked in front of her driveway with 2 men in reflective vests unloading equipment. One carried a chainsaw, the other a large tool bag. Rachel called out, asking what they were doing, and one of the men replied that they had been sent to trim and remove obstructive vegetation on the property. She knew instantly there was no legitimate reason for them to be there. Her lawn and hedges were meticulously maintained, and there were no city orders posted. When she pressed them for details, they mentioned the name Miller as the client. Her heart sank. Karen had sent them. Without raising her voice, Rachel told them they were on private property without permission and that the police had an open case involving damage to her property. She pulled out her phone, started dialing the non-emergency line, and within moments the men backed toward their truck muttering about just doing a job and not getting involved. They left quickly, but the interaction left her unsettled. It was a sign that Karen, or whoever was behind this, wasn't going to stop at the driveway. Rachel documented the encounter in writing immediately after, noting the time, date, the truck's license plate, and the company name printed on the side panel. She sent the information to her insurance adjuster and to the investigating officer, making sure every detail was on record. She also realized that if this was going to continue, She needed to protect herself without escalating into open conflict. That afternoon, she called a security company and arranged for the discreet installation of motion-activated cameras covering her front yard, driveway, and both side gates. She instructed the technician to place them in spots that would capture anyone approaching but wouldn't be obvious from the street. Not out of any desire to spy, but to ensure that if another incident occurred, there would be clear visual evidence. The very next evening, as she was preparing dinner, she heard a knock at the door. Standing there was a man in a collared shirt holding a clipboard, introducing himself as a community liaison, conducting an informal property compliance review. He spoke with a practiced politeness, explaining that concerns had been raised about non-operational vehicles being stored on the property and that he was there to verify compliance. Rachel listened without interrupting, then asked him directly which city department he represented. His answer was vague, citing a neighborhood oversight initiative, which she had never heard of. She asked for identification, and after a pause, he produced a laminated badge that looked generic and lacked any official city seal. Rachel told him plainly that if he had official business, it needed to be scheduled in writing through the city offices, and until then, he had no reason to be on her property. His polite demeanor tightened into something cooler, and he gave a thin smile before walking away without another word. When she checked the security footage later that night, she saw that before approaching her door, the man had stood across the street speaking with Karen for several minutes. The two had been out of earshot, but the body language was unmistakably familiar. Leaning in, gesturing toward Rachel's house, and nodding as if in agreement. That discovery stripped away any lingering doubt that Karen was orchestrating a campaign to push her into either conceding to some demand or making a misstep that could be used against her. The escalation didn't stop there. The following morning, Rachel found an envelope wedged into her front gate. Inside was a printed notice on letterhead from what claimed to be a residential improvement board, stating that she had incurred maintenance penalties for failure to remove non-compliant infrastructure and that additional charges would accrue if the matter wasn't resolved. The document listed no physical address, only a P.O. box for sending payments, and the penalties were conveniently rounded figures with no itemized explanation. Rachel recognized it for what it was, an intimidation tactic dressed up as bureaucracy. She placed the notice into a folder with the other documents and evidence, then called her attorney contact to discuss the possibility of a formal harassment complaint. Her attorney advised patience, explaining that each of these incidents, while deeply frustrating, was strengthening her legal position. The key, he said, was to continue documenting every approach, every notice, and every interaction, so that when the time came, there would be an undeniable pattern of targeted interference and unauthorized action. Rachel took the advice seriously, creating a dedicated logbook where she wrote down dates, times, descriptions, and the names of any companies or individuals involved. She understood now that she was dealing with a sustained campaign, not a single act of property damage. The driveway cement had been the opening move, and everything since was about tightening the pressure. That night, as she reviewed her notes and checked the camera feeds, she realized the psychological effect was as damaging as the physical acts. She was becoming hyper-aware of every sound outside, every car that slowed near her house, every shadow that moved across her porch light. The line between protecting herself and feeling under siege was blurring, but she refused to let that push her into reckless retaliation. She knew the next steps had to be deliberate and airtight, because if the other side wanted her to lose her composure, she had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. 2 weeks after the cement had first been poured, the pieces of the puzzle finally began to align into something that could be acted upon. Rachel received a call from the investigating officer, his tone more engaged than before. He informed her that they had contacted Premier Site Solutions and obtained job records showing that a cement pour had indeed been scheduled for her address on the exact date in question. The work order listed, "Authorized by K." Miller and had been paid for in cash, which made tracing the transaction more complicated, but the connection was now undeniable. The officer explained that while this wasn't yet a complete case, it was enough to justify formal questioning and a warrant for related communications if a judge agreed. Rachel felt a rush of vindication, quickly tempered by the knowledge that Karen would not react well once she realized the investigation had reached this point. That anticipation proved correct sooner than she expected. The following afternoon, as Rachel was speaking with her insurance adjuster on the phone, a loud thump rattled her front door. She looked through the peephole to see Karen standing there, her expression hard, holding what looked like a folded piece of paper. Without waiting for an invitation, Karen began speaking loudly enough to be heard through the door, accusing Rachel of making trouble, lying to the police, and wasting everyone's time over a parking issue. Rachel stayed silent, phone still in, her hand letting the adjuster hear the one-sided tirade. Karen shoved the folded paper into the doorframe and walked away briskly, glancing up at Rachel's security camera as she left. When Rachel retrieved the paper, it was a typed demand for resolution, full of exaggerated claims and veiled threats, stating that if Rachel didn't relinquish the obstructed portion of her property within 10 days, further action would be taken. She scanned the document, emailed it to her attorney, and filed it with the growing stack of evidence. The next day, she was called to the police station to give a formal recorded statement. The officer went through every document she had provided over the past 2 weeks, aligning them chronologically, and pointed out how the initial cement pour, the false maintenance crews, the compliance checks, and now the direct confrontation formed. A consistent pattern. He told her that the department's legal team believed they had enough to move forward with criminal charges for property damage, harassment, and attempted fraud. Hearing those words out loud lifted a weight from Rachel's shoulders, but it also made her aware that the conflict was about to become very public and very direct. Late that evening, as she was locking up for the night, she saw a pair of headlights pause at the end of her driveway before the car slowly rolled past. She couldn't make out the driver, but she recognized the outline of Karen's compact sedan in the dim light. The sight didn't frighten her as much as it might have a week earlier. Instead, it solidified her resolve. She now had law enforcement taking the matter seriously, an attorney building a case, and a file thick enough to show any judge that this wasn't a misunderstanding between neighbors. It was a targeted campaign of intimidation and unlawful interference. When she went to bed that night, she knew the next time she spoke about the cement in her driveway, it would be in a courtroom, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she believed the outcome could finally tilt in her favor. The court hearing came 3 weeks later, and by the time Rachel walked into the municipal courtroom, the months of quiet, methodical preparation had stripped away most of her initial anxiety. Her attorney laid out the case with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. The contractor's job logs, the unprocessed city request bearing Karen's name and the contractor's phone number, the laminated notices, the security footage of unauthorized workers attempting to access her property, and the recorded outburst on her porch. One by one, each piece was entered into the record, building a picture that was as deliberate as the cement pour itself. Karen's defense crumbled quickly. Her claim that she was acting in the interest of the neighborhood was met with the judge's sharp reminder that private property rights could not be overridden by personal opinion or unofficial action. When the verdict was read, Rachel felt the words more than she heard them. Karen was found liable for property damage, harassment, and attempted fraud, ordered to pay the full cost of removing and replacing the driveway, cover the legal fees, and compensate Rachel for lost income during the weeks her truck was trapped. Outside the courthouse, Rachel stood in the sunlight for a moment, the crisp air filling her lungs with a sense of relief she hadn't felt since before that morning she saw her driveway buried in gray stone. The removal crew arrived at her house the next day, chipping away the hardened slab and freeing the truck that had sat imprisoned for so long. Watching it roll back under its own power felt like reclaiming a part of her life that had been held hostage. She had no illusions that Karen would suddenly become a good neighbor, but the judgment had set clear boundaries backed by law, and Rachel had no intention of lowering her guard again. A week later, the new driveway was poured, this time under her supervision, and a discreet wrought iron gate was installed at the street end, not to shut out the world entirely, but to make it clear that what was hers would remain hers.